talk about, which is the borders of the land of Israel. So it's a confusing topic for many different reasons. First of all, I'm going to start from the beginning, I hope. There are the promised borders of the land of Israel that God promises the Jewish people. Then there's the actually conquered pieces of the land of Israel. What was actually conquered at what point? There were Jews that came up in the time of when they left Egypt and they conquered the land of Israel. And later on, King David, King Solomon conquered. And then they were exiled in the time of Babylon. And they come back, the Jews, in the time of Ezra, the second temple, after the Purim story. They come back and they settle the land of Israel. So there's a difference between the halachic boundaries of the land of Israel when it comes to sabbatical year, when it comes to tithing. There are all these different laws about boundaries of Israel connected to the Second Commonwealth when the Jews come back from Persia, Babylon, exile, and they come back after the Purim story. So at that point, so there are different laws associated. We're not going to talk about the legal elements because there are many different variables there. So once again, just a full circle. So we have here three different types of boundaries. We have the boundaries that God promises the Jewish people, number one. Boundaries number two, the ones the Jews actually conquer and occupy, or get permission in the Second Commonwealth to come back and live there. And then you have the laws of holiness and of tithing and of sabbatical year. That's another form of boundaries connected to these issues, but independent from the original promise. And so we have the promised, the actual, and the halachic. Okay? Those are the three different types. And in each one of these boundaries, we'll find in the promised boundaries some inconsistencies. So I'm going to start first with, try to go in order of the Torah first so we get an idea. But the reason why I picked this topic is it's connected to this week's Torah portion where we have this as well. So, there's one other element of borders. We find when the Jewish people at the cusp of entering the land of Israel, that the tribes of Gad and Reuven, who have lots of flocks, say, we're going to stay in Transjordan and we're going to make our home there, but we will fight with you. We will go out as pioneers, the front lines, and fight the enemy to conquer the land of Israel, and then we'll go back to our home in Transjordan. So there you have an expanded boundary of the land of Israel. So just to recap, you have the promises that God gives, and you have what the Jews actually conquer. You have the different law boundaries when it comes to tithing and Meiser and Shemitah, which are not exactly the same. And one other element, we have the expanded boundaries that Jews conquered on their own, like Gad and Reuven, and where they are in Transjordan. There's also the question, which we're not going to deal with today, but we do have to touch on it, about the mitzvah of conquering Israel. That when we read some of these texts, the question is there a mitzvah to conquer Israel today? In other words, to conquer all the lands that God promised. So in general, the assumption we're working with is that it's not a mitzvah today to conquer lands. So the reason why I bring this up is because the only place is that you'll find online that discuss the expanded borders of Israel are anti-Semitic websites. They have YouTube videos and maps and the greater Israel plans coming out of their ears. In other words, they're using it for fear-mongering in order to justify their horrific, ghoulish Gazan behavior or whatever else they're supporting, they use these biblical promises of a greater Israel to say this is the plot of the Jews that they want to take over. But I do think Jews are hesitant about discussing this online because they don't want to give fodder to anti-Semites. But we're a small group here. Everyone, we trust everyone. But really, the assumption that we work with here, halachic assumption, it's not a mitzvah today to conquer the land of Israel. However, there is a prohibition against giving up land of Israel today. Now, if somebody's life is in danger, of course, life takes precedence. However, as we spoke about in the past, holding on to territory is one of the most fundamental ways to ensure protection of lives, not the loss of life. In other words, having a strategic depth, having land boundaries and land borders easy to protect. These all things are life or death issues. And by allowing the Palestinian state or enemy combatants to live within your state and within your borders or within shooting distance and missile distance is a problem for your safety and security. We're not talking about that today. I know I spent a lot of time talking about what we're not talking about, but at least gives us a background here. So there's a separate question about what is the mitzvah of conquering, which we work with the assumption there is no mitzvah today to conquer. Nevertheless, there is the idea of holiness to the land that is considered part of the promised land and that which became sanctified by both the first the Jews came up from Egypt, but really reaffirmed when the second conquering in the second Commonwealth, the Jews came from Ezra. At the risk of oversimplifying, the laws of holiness of the land are primarily in the parts of the land that the Jews came back to and resettled in the second Commonwealth. The first conquering was done with coercion, so by force, they conquered it. So when the land of Israel, when the Jews were expelled, that holiness dissipated. However, the holiness that came back to the land of Israel when the Jews resettled in the second Commonwealth is permanent. And that's why we have these different approaches about Jewish law when it comes to tithing, sabbatical year, and things like that. Okay, so we're going to take a look at, we have these two different quotes that are in the Torah often that may be oversimplified. And they are, commonly described as from the Nile to the Euphrates. That's one boundary. Another one that is sometimes said is from Dan to Beersheba. Now, the problem is, this is a huge difference. From the Nile to the Euphrates is basically the entire Middle East, pretty much. And from Dan to Beersheba, Dan in the north and Beersheba in the south, this Dan is not the portion. All the tribes had portions, but there was a point in Israel in the northern corner that was called Dan. That was not in Dan's portion. But from Dan to Beersheba is a tiny sliver, not much bigger than the state of Rhode Island. So which one of these is true? So let's take a look. First, let's take a look at some texts, and then we'll look at some pictures. Okay, hold on here. Where's my share? All right, we'll start with this. When God tells Abraham, let's look here, satellite, a big picture here, okay? And we move in a little bit. Oops, too much. Okay. This is the anti-Semites love this one. The anti-Semites love this, but this really seems to be possibly the borders that God tells Abraham, and also in a few other places in the Torah. The Jews never had this. Our land of Israel is this little sliver over here. from Dan to Beersheba. You see my mouse is moving? So this is the minimalistic view of the land of Israel. And then we have the maximalist view, which is from the Euphrates, which runs all the way down here, to the river of Egypt. Now, the river of Egypt, there are different opinions. We're going to come back to this. This is an expanded version, and this is the minimalistic version. And the problem is when we look at the biblical text, is that we have different biblical texts. What can I tell you? So we're going to have to come back to this. Let's take a look. So, yeah, we're going to come back to this. Don't worry. This is going to be important. All right. So I want to go here. I'll make this a drop larger. Okay. So this is at the covenant of the pieces, at the birth of the Jewish people. On that day, God made a covenant with Abraham. To your offspring, I assign this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river of Euphrates. So the river of Egypt, we got to know, what is this river of Egypt? I'm going to give you a hint. Here's the issue. First of all, according to this version that you're seeing here, Cairo's in Israel. Cairo is in Israel, according to this version. If the river of Egypt, the problem is the Nile had different heads in olden days, where it came from the Mediterranean here. I'm sorry, it ran into the Mediterranean here. It's running the other way, the river, the Nile. It's a great river that runs this direction as opposed to most other rivers. And the story is that because of silt and all sorts of storms coming in over hundreds of years, many of the headwaters that you read about in Herodotus or ancient writings that where the Nile came out are no longer there. And a matter of fact, some of these places that were on the border, on the coast, are now a few miles inland. But the point is, where the Suez Canal is today, some see that is where around there, that's where the river of Egypt was. Others make it a bit further, but others see it in this Wadi, I think it's Al Arif. We'll see where Israel fought some wars in the Sinai. So basically, the river of Egypt, is it the Nile? We don't know exactly. We have different opinions. Honestly, we don't know. We have different opinions about the interpretation of these words. Because sometimes we have the river of Egypt, then we have other terms, as we're going to see. I'm going back to the text, though. So here we have, I assign to your offspring, I assign this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the Cani, Kenizi, Kadmoni, Chiti, Prizi, the Rephaim, Amori, Kanani, Gergashi, Yevusi. I'm not going to ask everyone to repeat that in their own words, but the question is, how many nations live here? Take a look, count. Cani, Kenizi, Kadmoni, that's 3. Chiti, Prizi, Rephaim, that's 6. Amori, Kanani, Gergashi, Yevusi, that's 10. However, in the rest of the Bible, it's called the land of the 7 nations. Because in Jewish tradition, we never conquered the lands of the Cani, Kenizi, Kadmoni. Cani, Kenizi, and Kadmoni were promised, but never actualized. When the Mashiach will come, I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but it says later on, when Hashem will broaden your borders, you should add cities of refuge. And this is referring to these lands that will be added to the land of Israel, promised initially by God, Cani, Kenizi, Kadmoni. I would just say that let's do a little bit of the mystical for a moment. The 7 nations of the land of Canaan symbolize and represent. Okay, so Eric is asking, wasn't Transjordan part of the mandate? Transjordan was not. It was added by the Bnei Manasseh and Gad. And I'm sorry, Gad, Reuven, and half of Manasseh. So that is Eric's question. But yes, so Gad, Reuven, and half of Manasseh end up being in Transjordan, and that becomes part of Israel. We're going to come back because that image I showed you is not a universal understanding even of the expanded borders. So once again, the covenant, the forming of the Jewish people, God promises them a land of 10 nations. The rest of the time, we only speak of 7 nations. So the basic understanding is that when the Messiah will come, Hashem will broaden the boundaries and they'll get the land of the Canaanite, Kenizi, Kamoni. The mystical understanding of this is that each one of us is a land of Canaan. Each one of us, the word Eretz comes from the word Ratzon, will. And each one of us is territory, fertile territory, that has to be conquered and transformed. We have our animal soul, which are the negative attributes of kindness, of severity. So kindness run amok is when we're kind to terrorists. Kindness run amok is when we have too much giving and we don't have healthy boundaries. Severity run amok is cruelty. Severity run amok is discipline to others, but not discipline for yourself. The point is we have 7 foreign nations living in our land, and we have to conquer it and transform it. And the service of the Jewish people, even outside of Israel, is to make their personal land of Israel, their little life, into an Eretz Chayfetz, a desirous, beautiful land. So this is when we speak of, in the biblical text, get rid of the Canaanites, drive them from the land. First of all, that was referring to a very specific time in history. It doesn't mean every foreigner in the land of Israel has to be expelled. In other words, we have to be very careful when we take a biblical text out of context, not seen through the lens of the traditional understanding and reading. But now I'm taking it to the mystical meaning is no matter where you live, Guilford, Brantford, New York, you are trying to conquer the land of Canaan and turn it into the land of Israel. How do you expel the Gentile within you, the idol worshiper within you, who is this negative influence? Transform it is the idea. But in this exile, in our lifetime, you could only transform your emotions. It's very difficult to elevate your mind in the sense of to transform how you think. Your ways of thinking is very different. You can control what you think about, but to actually control and change, you can change your attributes by acting nicely. It's not so easy, we say, to transform the intellect. So in mystical thought, I know I'm going off tangent a little bit, the 7 represent the 7 emotions, and the 3 that are not conquered and will be conquered when the Messiah comes represents Chachma, Bina, and Das, wisdom, knowledge, understanding, which is an acronym Chabad. That's where it comes from, the Kabbalistic trio that represents the intellectual ability. That will be transformed when the Messiah comes. Jumping back from the mystical into the real land of Israel, we have the promise to Abraham that seemingly is never fulfilled. The land of Canaan, Kenizi, Kadmoni, and the land of the 7. Now, in this week's Torah portion, we have God speaks to the Jews. Till now, we have this conversation. Now, this portion, this is a question when exactly this is said, but God is telling them, I am sending a messenger before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have made ready. He's saying about the angel, whether this is talking about after they had sinned with the golden calf or not. But he says, this is a whole debate God has with Moses about who will lead the Jews into the land. Will it be an angel who will lead the Jews through the desert and into the land? Will it be an angel or God himself? And the basic understanding is once they enter the land of Israel, there'll be these angelic forces there. And they say, pay heed to him and obey him, do not defy him, for he will not pardon your offenses since my name is in him. But if you obey him and do all that I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies and foe to your foes. In the book of Joshua, one of the first experiences you see there of Joshua, he's preparing for battle. and he's up at night, and an angel appears to him with a drawn sword. And he says to the angel, "Are you with us or are you against us?" And he says, "I am the leader of the legions of God. Take off your shoes, for the land that you stand on is holy." The angel there does not communicate anything to Joshua. He just tells him that. The classic understanding in the rabbinic text is that Joshua is being rebuked for not studying Torah, even though there was war the next day. He had some free time. He should have studied Torah because God had told him before you should toil in Torah day and night. So that's one opinion. But there's another closer to the text approach that says this is the leader, the angel that's coming to represent God. And he says, "Are you with our enemies or with our foes?" The angel doesn't answer. He says, "I work for God," because that's the angel we're talking about here. The angel is the head of the legions of God. If the Jews behave right, so then he will be an enemy to their enemies. And then he says, God continues, "When my angel," the Hebrew here is messenger, the English is translated messenger, but kiyelach malachi lefanecha, when my messenger or my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Canaanite, the Hivite, the Jebusites, and I annihilate them. Now we have 6, because one of them had fled. One of the nations had fled. But then God says this promise: "You shall not bow down to their gods and worship and follow their practices, but you shall tear down and smash their pillars to bits. You shall serve your God, who will bless your Hashem, who will bless your bread and your water. I will remove sickness from your midst. No woman in your land shall miscarry, be barren. I will let you enjoy the full count of your days. I will send," and he says, "I will send forth my terror before you, and I'll throw into panic all the people among whom you come. And I'll make all your enemies turn tail before you. I'll send a plague ahead of you, and shall drive out before you the Hivites, the Canaanites, the Hittites." And then God says something interesting, which may give us a hint for our future issues about the land of Israel having expandable borders. Look what God says. "I will not drive them out before you in a single year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply to your hurt." Basically, if they're going to slowly take over the farmland and the settled areas, it would have to be incremental and not sudden. If it had emptied out suddenly, everything would have overgrown. You leave a house alone for a year or two, everything falls apart. You leave a country uninhabited, everything falls into decay, and the animals multiply. He says, "I'll drive them out before you little by little until you have increased and possessed the land. I will set your borders from the Sea of Reeds to the Sea of Philistia." Okay, and here we have another one. "I will put your boundaries or borders from the Yam Suf, from the Sea of Reeds, to the Sea of the Philistines." So again, where is that exactly? So the Philistines are where along Gaza. The Yam Suf is more the Red Sea. In other words, the Sea of the Philistines is the corner of the Mediterranean, seemingly. And the Yam Suf is just a drop lower. So the question becomes, what is that border exactly? Okay, we'll come back to this. And then he says, "And from the wilderness to the Euphrates, Midbar ad Nahar, to the great river. For I'll deliver the inhabitants of the land to your hand, and you'll drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them or their gods. They shall not remain in your lands. They cause you to sin against me. You'll serve their gods or prove a snare to you." God is telling the Jews 2 things. I know this is off topic a little bit. In other places, God already told them that the Canaanites deserve to be punished for all their evil doing. They sacrificed the children to Molech. They were terrible idol worshippers. They were terribly full of crime and negativity. And God says, "I'm not going to flip them over like I did Sodom and Gomorrah. You're going to be the tip of the spear. You're going to expel them because the time for their punishment has come." A matter of fact, in the Torah, it says one of the reasons why the Jews stay in the desert 40 years, because the measure of sin for the Canaanites to be expelled had not yet been filled, which means part of their being kicked out of the land and being dispossessed and the land being given to the Jews was because their time had come up because of their sin. Of course, the land of Israel from the very beginning of creation is promised to the Jewish people, but it's not promised when they will get it. If you remember, we have different numbers, numbers of how long the Jews were in Egypt. We say they were there 210 years because God calculated from either the covenant of the pieces 430 years, or from the birth of Abraham, for the birth of Isaac, 400 years, to fulfill what he had told Abraham, you'll be a stranger in a strange land. But because the persecution of the Jews was so great, God let them out early, not for good behavior necessarily. Some say it was because of the holiness and the righteousness of the Jewish women. The Jews got out early, 210, and God recalculated, like we say in the Haggadah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu chishev es haketz. He calculated the end, which means he took them out early. But the point is, when he takes the Jews out early, it's not fair to the Canaanites, who their sin had not yet hit critical mass. So one of the understandings of how it turns out that the Jews end up in the desert, not just because of their sin about not wanting to enter the land, but also because the sin of the Amorites had not yet reached their critical mass. But going back, so number one is the Jews are supposed to expel the Canaanites for the Canaanites' own sins. And the land of Israel was promised to the Jews from the beginning of time. And a matter of fact, it had belonged to the Semites before the Canaanites had taken over. The Canaanites had expelled or conquered the Semites who had been there before. So the Jews coming back to the land of Israel was the Semites' inheritance. Which Semite God promised Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, specifically to their children. So it was meant to come back to them. But God says something interesting. He says, if you allow the Canaanites to stay in the land, they're going to be a negative influence. You're going to worship idols, and you're going to get kicked out. You're going to get killed and kicked out and suffer. You should know this. The land of Israel has a very sensitive stomach. It vomits out those who act immorally. So I'm telling you up front, the only way you're going to be able to stay in the land of Israel is you kick them out. And the Jews did not do it. They were not good at following. They weren't able to get rid of the Canaanites. They didn't do it. They didn't follow through. And ultimately, they become corrupted and they get expelled themselves, ultimately. Now, this is not a command for all time and places that no Gentiles are allowed to live in the land of Israel. That's not true. We have resident sojourners. The Canaanites were a very specific commandment. Even the Philistines were not related to our Palestinians, although there was an attempt by the Romans to use the same term. But the point is, there was no commandment to drive out the Philistines. It was these Canaanites. Okay, so now we're going further. Now in Numbers, we have here a much more detailed description of the borders. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, when you enter the land of Canaan, here are the various boundaries. Your southern sector shall extend from the wilderness of Sin alongside Edom. Your southern will start on the east from the tip of the Dead Sea. Your boundaries will then turn to pass south of the ascent, etc. I'm going to go back and look at the map in a second. There's much more detail. Draw a line from the Great Sea. For the western, from Asma, the boundaries will turn towards, they translated this as the Wadi of Egypt. The verse says here is Nachla Mitzrayim. So Nachla is this wadi, this stream, as opposed to a river. So we have different terms being used here. This shall be your northern boundary. So draw a line from the Great Sea to Mount Hor. From Mount Hor, draw a line to, let me see where we are here. We're in verse 8. Har Har. Now, Har is not the same mountain that you would find in the Torah where Aaron dies. That's in Transjordan. So Har is up in the north. Well, I'm going to show you the map in a second. Okay. Basically, a lot of details here. A lot of details. Then he says, this is the land you received by Lot. And then here he says, this is the point Eric had asked about. For the Reubenite tribe by its ancestral house, the Gadite tribe by its ancestral house, and the half-tribe and Asher have already received their portions on the other side of Jordan. Now, if you remember the story there, Gad and Reuben had lots of flocks of sheep and cattle. And they said, we can't go to the land of Israel. There's not enough room for our possessions. So they want to stay on the other side. And Moshe makes a condition that they go and lead the battle in the land of Israel until all the Jews have divided and conquered and divided the land. Then they could go back to their families in Transjordan, where they had all their possessions. You know, what interesting thing is, as an aside, Moses had prayed to make it to the land of Israel. He didn't, but the land of Israel was extended to where he was. In other words, these expanded boundaries of these 2.5 tribes ends up making it part of Israel in a way. Of course, that's not what Moses intended. He wanted to come in and be able to do the commandments. But here's an interesting thing. Why is half of Manasseh chosen? They didn't ask for this. No one asked them to speak. I mean, where do they get plucked from? So the tribe of Manasseh were known as those who loved the land of Israel. How do we know this? The daughters of Zelophehad were of the tribe of Manasseh, and they protest to God about not getting a portion in the land of Israel. Their father dies, and there were no male children, and they wanted their father to have a possession in the land, and they complained. They love the land of Israel. So God comes up with an idea. Let's take Manasseh and split it in half. Half will be on one side of the Jordan in Israel, half will be in Transjordan in this new area, because these 2.5 tribes will ultimately keep the 2.5 tribes united, because everyone's going to be going back and forth for simchas, for weddings, for bar mitzvahs, for brises, for all sorts of things. They're going to communicate with one another. This idea of keeping the bond between the Jews living outside the core land of Israel and those living on Transjordan is Manasseh is going to be the bridge. And this is one of our challenges today, by the way, with the land of Israel and the diaspora. The fact that there are people that go back and forth, they become like the Manasseh. They become like the connectors, and they come back to their places here in the land in the diaspora. Okay. So in Deuteronomy, we have a commandment that God says. He again gives these different geographic locations. Let me go now, and he says, "I place the land at your disposal. Go take possession the land that God swore to your fathers to assign them." And then he says, look at verse 24. Every spot which your foot treads shall be yours. Your territory shall extend from the wilderness to the Lebanon, and from the river the Euphrates to the western sea. Let's go back here. I have my nephew on here who knows this stuff much better than I do. I met him in Shul today. And he said, "Oh, come on and give me a hand." All right, so here's what we have here. First of all, not everybody understands. I don't know if I could move it. I can't. So this is the expanded one. And the question is, how high is this tip? Is it all the way up in Turkey, which Erdogan said the Jews want to take over Turkey? Or is it closer down by Beirut? In between here and here, you have these different discussions about how high. But for sure, much of Lebanon is supposed to be part of Israel and was part of Israel. And then the question becomes, going back to this wadi, is it over here where my finger is? Or is it here near the Suez Canal? Or, see, they made it here where the Nile is today, but the Nile, where it had come out before in different locations, it seems to have been closer to where the Suez Canal is today. And then going this way, so some see, I'll pick another picture in a second. I'm going to share another picture, but some see, you see where Jordan is? So some see that, here, let's just do this. So this number 4 is Euphrates. Number 1 is Dan. Down here is Beersheba, so this small triangle, which is close to the land of Israel today. And then here we have this river of Egypt, which could be here. So some see that doesn't go all the way to the Persian Gulf. You see this problem here? The issue is like this. The Red Sea ends up both in here, it ends up in Suez, and it ends up, the Persian Gulf is also part of it. So the question is, are the boundaries from here all the way across in a straight line? Others understand that the land of Israel goes like this. From like here, even the expanded borders, the Jordan is the natural border of the land of Israel. and then it bulges out this way. Yosef, correct me if I'm wrong. Some understand that it doesn't go straight across this way in the promised, but rather it goes up until the top of Jordan and then extends outward to this area of parts of Syria. Yes, Yosef.
The issue of the river as boundaries is a common one. But every time it's mentioned, it's always talked about as partial boundaries and referring to specific direction. Even if Nachal Mitzrayim means the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, which is highly unlikely because then the Jews would have been in the land of Israel like around the time that the sea split, and that really doesn't make any sense. But even if that
let's just clarify that for a second. Some of these expanded boundaries, the expanded boundaries that they hadn't conquered, would be even in Egypt itself when they already crossed the sea. And I'm sorry, when they crossed the sea, they would be in biblical Israel, even though it was considered part of Egypt then.
And it's very clear they weren't.
Right.
All right, because it says you haven't come yet, but now you are coming. Right. This is 40 years later. So the Euphrates being the border refers specifically to a northern border, and only a northern border.
Right, so not this big bulge out here going to the Persian Gulf. In other words, it would be up here alongside Jordan and then come out with a bulge up here by Syria.
And this is clear because it says the desert on one side, not the Euphrates on the east. It's the desert.
Right, and this is all desert. Just so people understand, this area of here between Iraq and Jordan is all desert. It's all jihads and desert. That's what we're talking about here. All right, keep going, Yosef.
Being that that's the case, these imaginary borders, even though I've seen even Chumashim write these borders, don't agree with any description of the borders. The only thing you can say is that until you've come to the Euphrates, even across the desert, you could argue that you haven't crossed a border that forbids you from being in the land of Israel. It says that if you're on the other side of the Euphrates, you aren't in Israel. Now that refers to the northern border. So you want to argue the desert can also be within the borders, even if you conquer it? Well, yeah, if you conquer it, it gets incorporated, sure. It's not like Egypt will, one day become Israel. That doesn't really work. But that's as far as you can go. The desert is the border, and that's it. The sea is the border, and that's it. You can't include everything in sight.
Okay.
So Euphrates is the northern border.
Right. Okay. So the question, I'm gonna find another picture here in a second. I'm just gonna open it for a moment. Let me just open up a picture and then share. Here.
I got to mute for a second because they're screaming.
No problem. Okay, here's one. I'm just gonna share this. Okay. So here we go. Let's share. And then we'll get more into the northern border. So I know it's in Hebrew, this one, but what you have here, in other words, it going up. This would be the Euphrates up here going through the desert of Syria up here, and this would be the high point. And here's another one. Hold on. This is southern border. So the southern border would be, again, from the Dead Sea, where my thing is, and then coming up here to this river of Egypt. Now, it could be here, Al-Arish, right here. Al-Arish, some say this is the river of Egypt that's going through the beginning of the Sinai. Okay, right here's Al-Arish.
Which must be according in the Midbar, in the numbers borders, that it has to be. It can't be the Nile.
It says Nachal. It says a Nachal.
And it says you haven't come yet. If they had already, if the Nile was a border, Pelusium, whatever, I think it's Pelusium, then it would then they would have already been there.
Okay, so this is another one. This I'm not so sure exactly, but this is an English one at least. You see how it bulges out here? This would have been this land of Israel. It takes you Mount Hor. So here, Sidon and Tyre. So for sure, part of Lebanon would be included in biblical Israel. And Ad, Edom, Moab, Ammon, that was conquered by the Reuven, Gad, and half of Manasseh settles there. Okay, so basically, one of the approaches that we're taking here is that God is giving an option of an expandable border here that doesn't have to be, that doesn't have to happen. If you take a look at the ultimate, Israel is found in between two great empires, Ashur and Egypt. It's right. It is the stepping stool. It is not stepping stool. It is the crossroads of the world of the time. And in the prophets, it talks about how God will make these three entities, Ashur, Assyria, Egypt, and Israel, great in the future of the Messianic age. And part of that is connected to this idea of Israel will be expanded in a way that it will be the crossroads of that part of civilization. So just going back for a second, I just want to be able to. So in Numbers, we had the Litani River. You know, Litani River has been in the news. So the minimalistic approach that we spoke about, that the northern border is southern Lebanon along the Litani River until the Metula area. That's a minimalistic view. The southern border runs along the Beersheba Gaza line in the northern Negev. On the other hand, the maximalistic approach will say the northern border is somewhere up in Turkey and northern Syria, and the southern border is somewhere deep in the Sinai Desert. That's the minimal. And the eastern frontier, even though it's clearly the Jordan River, we still know the Gad and Reuven, they expanded into present-day Jordan. So why are they so expandable? Are certain parts of the land, holier than others? So I'm just going back for a minute and recap, and Yosef can interject at any point. First, we have the land promised to Abraham, the land that I will show you. I'll give this land to your offspring. And then he says, all the land that you see. And he enters with two covenants with God. And they define the promised land, but each one's an entirely different piece of land. By the covenant of the pieces, he says, from the river of Egypt, which seems to be the Nile, to the river of the Euphrates, the 10 nations. But then when he gets the circumcised, God says, I'm giving you the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan is even though it appears for the first time, we already mentioned the geographic location in the portion of Noah. It said in Noah, in Genesis 10, you can look it up online, that the border of the Canaanite was from Sidon, which is Litani Valley in Lebanon, down the coastal plain to Gerar and Gaza. And from Sidon down to the Syrian-African Rift to Sodom and Amorah, the Dead Sea area. In other words, Abraham himself is getting two different promises. One at the covenant of the pieces, and one the covenant of the bris. So that really is the general area. The second one where the bris was, that's the place of their sojourn. They lived in that area between Beersheba and Gerar to the south, and the areas of Nablus, Shechem, and Dosan to the north. And during his battle against the four kings, Abraham went all the way up to Dan. Remember, Dan is at northern point on the map. So this is where Dan to Beersheba becomes like the name of the place where the forefathers lived. And in the Tanakh later on, it defines the populace of the land of Israel. Like it says, like in Samuel, for example, and all the Jews from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was trustworthy. It became an expression for the Jewish people. That's where they lived. So we have the conflicting borders of the land of Israel already being presented by the covenant of the pieces and by the covenant of Bris Milah. So each one is related in some way to the land. So one way of looking at this, I'm just picking one approach. So you have the covenant of the pieces, which is and we have the covenant of the bris. What's the difference in the covenant of the bris? There's a historical national aspect of the Jewish people's relationship with God. That's the covenant of the pieces. It's about the Jewish people are going to get the haaretz, the land, and they'll get a Yerusha, they'll get an inheritance. But for the covenant of the bris, it's a little bit different. It's a close, intimate relationship with God and the Jewish people, the religious, personal element of the Jewish people. That's Eretz Canaan. And this, by the way, is used, the terminology is used achuza, which is like the inheritance transmitted from a father to a son, as opposed to the word Yerusha, which is connected to conquest as well. All right, so we have two ideas of holiness in the land of Israel. You have the national element, which is the conquest of the land. It becomes a sovereign state. And that happens when the Jewish people do it with Joshua. And that's when they stop becoming obligated in tithing. And then there's a personal aspect already exists in the time of the forefathers, stays eternal. This holiness is God's special providence over the land, even while inhabited by other nations. This intrinsic holiness is forever there. Doesn't matter who it belongs to. Just like the Jewish people are intrinsically Jewish, no matter how many times you convert out, you're always a Jew. The land of Israel. What land of Israel is always holy? This land, the personal part from Dan to Beersheba, pretty much where our forefathers lived. This land of Canaan, that became, so to speak, a eternal holiness that didn't change. It doesn't change. So one of the interesting things is if you look at the language used, one is connected to conquest and one is just by virtue of dwelling there. By understanding these two different covenants, now we can possibly reconcile the question of the land's borders. When Hashem chooses Abraham to be a blessing for all the other nations, so we're talking about for all the nations, that's the land between the Nile and the Euphrates. They're not borders. It's rather, this is the civilization. There were two centers of ancient civilization: Mesopotamia, Nahar Pras, and Egypt, Nahar Mitzrayim. This is where it was, the Euphrates and the Nile. This was the center of civilization. So this is the idea of the Jewish people becoming a blessing to all mankind. And this is the kernel of it, is where our forefathers lived, which is the holiness. And this is supposed to make us more sensitive by living in this land of Israel. Just like we spoke about the land vomiting out those who acted morally, the covenant of the bris, of circumcision, is related to this similar idea of holiness. So basically what we have here, I'm going to pull this all together again, and then we'll talk about some of the other themes. But the basic borders of Eretz Yisrael would more be from Dan to Beersheba, like promised by the covenant of the bris. And they're a natural geographic area. You have the Mediterranean on the west, the Negev on the south, the Syrian African Rift, which is the Jordan River to the east, and the Lebanon mountain range to the north. Once this kernel is conquered, it could expand. It doesn't have to expand. In other words, this is one way of reading it. It's expandable. It doesn't have to. So in other words, it could be time of King David, King Solomon. So it's seen as a limit rather than a border, as each river represented a center of ancient civilization. In other words, the Jewish role is not to take over Egypt or the Mesopotamia. It's rather to be in the center of that and bordering both. So, and this is, the idea of expanding the holiness is what happens when the children of Gad and Reuven take over Transjordan. So I just want to pull this all together, but my nephew Yosef can add some of the more technical stuff. Just want to get back to like the spiritual dimension of the land of Israel. You have the land of Israel. You have in life things that are obligatory. And obligatory of either doing or not doing, to do the mitzvot or not to sin. So, but you also have expanding the borders of holiness. When we use neutral things in our life to serve God, we're conquering. In other words, when I eat and drink and relax and enjoy life in a way that helps me study or pray better. I go to relax on the back porch and I take a sefer, a book. Instead of just enjoying the sun, I'm making it something holy. I save the good food for Shabbat. All these things is taking the neutral and making it holy. This is the idea of the expanded borders that each one of us can have in our own life. And you can make it Israel. There's a famous story at least for Chabadniks, it's a famous story, that the Tzemach Tzedek was asked by a follower for a blessing to go travel and move to the land of Israel. And in those days, it was not easy going to Israel, and the trip wasn't easy, and being there wasn't easy. There was no infrastructure. You were supported either by your own money till it ran out or by charity. And Tzemach Tzedek told him, instead of going to Israel, make Israel here. The idea that where we find ourselves has the ability to reveal the holiness of Israel in every place where we are, he said, Machda Eretz Yisrael, is very much how we view exile and diaspora as being part of the plan. In other words, it's not just a punishment for sin. The fact that we find ourselves in New Haven, Branford, Guilford, Madison, wherever we are, is part of the mission as well, to reveal the godliness that's there. That God won't just be in one locale in the land of Israel, but throughout the world. We say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord of God, the Lord is one. The Rashi says, we're saying, Hear, O Israel, right now, the Lord is our God. But in the future, the Lord is one. So we find other Talmudic statements that freak out the anti-Semites, where it says, the land of Israel will expand to include all the other lands. What does this mean? It doesn't have to mean literally. What it means is the holiness of the land of Israel will be felt throughout the world. And the holiness of Jerusalem be felt throughout Israel. And the holiness of the temple be felt in Jerusalem. The idea that we, in our work here, we're not just Israel focused. We're not just the poor cousins. We're in the diaspora. Number one is there's a mission until the Messiah comes to transform the world, and that helps bring peace and expanded borders and universal knowledge of God to the world by us doing our job in this end. All right, I'm going to go back to the map and let my nephew talk a little bit more about these problems of the borders. So the north part. Let's go to the north part for a second. So let me make it bigger, and you'll help us understand. So basically, the issue of Lebanon is interesting because Damascus is over here.
One interesting thing about Lebanon is that the land of the Phoenicians, the Tzidonim, are never mentioned, or almost never mentioned, as part of the land of Israel or land of Canaan, even though they are the firstborn of Canaan. And the Jewish people almost always had friendly relations with the Phoenicians. So it's possible that they were just allowed these enclaves because they were mostly on the coast, mostly coastal fishing and trading cities. But it is strange because the land then falls squarely within any kind of border by any calculation, and yet they're not included in the nations, nor are they usually included as nations that have to be dealt with.
Right. But did they have independent sovereignty, or were they more dyers of wool and merchants and seafarers? Like the Druze today, in other words, do we know of an empire there?
No, they never, they were, there's no record of a unified Phoenician state until Carthage on the other side of the Mediterranean. But these cities, because of their wealth, were kind of like, Venice and Genoa. They were incredibly powerful compared to the states around them, especially when we're talking about Bronze Age and early Iron Age states, and therefore they're able to exert quite a bit of power. But they never had a large hinterland, to the extent that even King Solomon trades food, just grain, to the king of Tyre in exchange for craftsmen and work and various rare materials.
So if we talk about the minimalistic view, would be by the right here, Dan Beersheva, right? Which is is Dan already in Lebanon?
Isn't that it's at least paralleling some of it?
Right. And then we have here further up, so we have either the borders that are given are either here, up here, and it was not taking over Damascus, right?
Because Damascus is very clearly outside the land of Israel.
Right.
So the border has to slide by it somehow.
Right. And then the question becomes about here. Right. All right, good. This is helpful. Thank you very much for the anything else you want to add about the geography and the topography and the borders that we didn't cover?
Eric Watsky asked the question that's one of the most difficult. Where's Mount Hor?
Right. It's not the same one.
It's also
that's the whole big debate. It's one of these three. That's one of the. It goes either. That's the big debate. Also, there's a line through the water as well. That's another issue. But either it's up here, or it's down here, or it's down here. Har Har is either, in other words, it's anywhere from into Turkey, into the top part of Lebanon, or the lower part of Lebanon. I think there's three approaches.
And there's two Har Hars in Chumash itself. The Har Har.
Right, the other one is here where Aaron dies.
There's no way that it's the same one.
No, of course not.
So you already have two in Chumash. Who knows how many there are, and identifying it. It's a very generic name also, the Mountain of Mountains.
Right. It's anytime you had seemingly a mountain range and one stood above the others. That's why some see it as the second group of mountains in the Hermon range as being, because you're looking down, you can see Damascus from them. You have to see the topography as well. Okay.
Hard when it's highlighted.
Any other thoughts, Yosef? I have an expert on here on ancient Rome. Tell us about the antecedents of the Philistines as opposed to there would seem to be a seafaring group and also more inland.
To have a proper discussion of the Pelishtim, you have to do a lot of Bronze Age archaeology. But we see in Bereshis that the king of Gur is not called the king of Pelishtim until later. And we also see the political situation shifting as his people have different titles. They go from being his servants to being his shepherds, then they become his friends. The general starts poking his head into all the business and seems to be almost a co-equal, or at least has to be consulted every time. There were movements from various people over the seas, from Cyprus and Crete. There was more than one stage. It wasn't just the sea peoples of the final collapse of the Bronze Age. There were earlier movements as well. And you could also see that because even Ramses III, who writes about them, at least that one inscription that we have from him, he knows who they are. He's already encountered them. So there's more than one movement, and there's these changes as different parts, which are hinted at or partly explained by the famines mentioned by the forefathers. But there are different moments of certain areas just drying up, and they become too arid to support agriculture. People either move away, historians move in, and this movement happens, and that may be part of the explanation of what's going on over here. Because the Avim are some called Pelishtim, some is not.
All right, but what's interesting is you have, the Phoenicians were friends, it says, with Solomon all the days. We say, the Midrash says, is that the king of the Phoenicians is either a descendant or even a very long-living friend of Judah, Yehuda, one of the 12 tribes. He had been friends with Hiram all the days. In other words, it's a long-time alliance. So just we spoke about last week, the Druze. Now we touched on the Phoenicians. There doesn't have to be antagonism with the Gentiles. Even those who were outside the land of Israel might have been idol worshippers. You could still get along with them. How much more so those who are willing in the land of Israel to be God-fearing and fellow travelers and things of that nature. All right, so I think we, the full circle is the land of Israel has expandable borders. There is the kernel and the core that we agree on. How far could it be expanded is an interesting question. The approach we took here is that it's not in stone. It really depends. It ebbs and flows. And it's the idea of being in between these two great empires of influencing the world. And I would just close with when the Solomon was in Jerusalem, it is said that all the sparks of holiness from around the world was attracted like sparks to a larger flame. In other words, he didn't have to go to Guildford to elevate the sparks of holiness. The sparks from Queen of Sheba and all these others came to him. There are different ways that we can influence the world around us. Sometimes we have to be there in person, and it's difficult work. Other times we set an example, and people look and see and learn from our example. So there are different approaches. So the land of Israel is a little bit more the idea of being a light by creating a civilization that is something that the rest of the world admires in morality, in holiness, in godliness, in helping others. And when we're outside the land of Israel, it's a little more engagement involved with the world around us in a more direct way at times. All right, let it be with God's help. We should very soon see the time when the world will be filled with the knowledge of God. No one will lift up sword against anyone else. The temple will be rebuilt, and the land of Israel will expand to where it needs to be, but all in a peaceful, wonderful, enjoyable way, so we don't have to have any more negativity. Any thoughts? I'm going to stop the share here. Thank you, Yosef, for adding your knowledge.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right, we'll have to do some others with you as far as the technical elements of all these issues. You pick the subject next time. We're going to talk next week about the central role of the temple in Judaism, and issues today about people who want to build the temple, go up on the Temple Mount, and the problems with that we will touch on next week, but also the centrality of the temple in Jewish thought. All right, everyone, have a good Shabbos.
Shabbos.